The following disclaimer is for those in California only. Pursuant to California Assembly Bill 2571, it is illegal for the advertisement and or marketing of any firearm-related products and or programs in a manner that is designed, intended, or reasonably appears to be attractive to minors. As such, if you are currently in California, this program is restricted to only those that are over 18. Please turn this program off now if you are in California and under 18. Now, on to the program. Hello and welcome to the centertenspodcast. Centertens is a podcast that discusses small bore and precision air rifle from junior shooting sports on up to NCAA collegiate and Olympic competition. And now here's your host, Adam Pearson. Welcome back to Centertens. Let's go ahead and get started as we review week 6 of the fall season of NCAA rifle competition. We had 9 competitions this week, so we're going to start off with Jacksonville State versus the Citadel at the Citadel. That was fired on Friday, October 27th. Jacksonville State came out on top with a 46-83 to Citadel's mixed team of 45-96. Jacksonville State had a small bore score of 23-26 to their air rifle score of 23-57. Citadel had a small bore of 22-73 and an air of 23-23. The scoring teams for Jacksonville State in small bore, we had Franz Rasmussen at 587, Sam Burrow at 582, Clark McWhorter at 579, and Lars Lillinge with a 578. In an air, Franz Rasmussen had a 591, as well as Sam Burrow with a 591, Annie Iannotti with a 588, and Kim Jettenberg with a 587. Jacksonville State's top shooter was Franz Rasmussen with an aggregate score of 1178. For the Citadel in small bore, James Hart IV with a 580, Charlotte Welsh with a 574, Carson Wood with a 569, and Daniel Shapiro with a 550. Their air rifle team was James Hart with a 590, Charlotte Welsh with a 585, Carson Wood with a 578, and Daniel Shapiro with a 570. Top shooter for the Citadel was James Hart IV with an aggregate score of 1170. And then as we move on to Saturday the 28th, we're going to look at Alabama Birmingham versus the Citadel, and they were also there at the Citadel. Alabama topped that with an aggregate score of 46-10, which was a program record for Alabama Birmingham. They had a small bore score of 22-83 and an air rifle score of 23-27. The Citadel mixed team had an aggregate of 45-93 with a small bore score of 22-71 and an air rifle score of 23-22. For the scoring teams, Alabama Birmingham, their small bore team was Emily Buck with a 573. Amy Cohan matched her with a 573. Christopher Comstock with a 569. And Gracie Turk with a 568. In an air, Gracie had a 586. Christopher Comstock with a 583. Megan McLaughlin with a 580. And Claire Vonderow with a 578. Gracie Turk was the top scorer for UAB with an 1154 aggregate. For the Citadel, the small bore team was James Hart IV with a 580, Carson Wood with a 575, then we had Charlotte Welsh with a 563, and Dalton Bownite with a 553. And for air team was James Hart IV with a 591, Charlotte Welsh with a 585, Carson Wood with a 577, and Dalton Bownite with a 569. The next match, Georgia Southern at VMI. Georgia Southern competed both against the VMI mixed team and the VMI women's team and came out on top with an aggregate of 47-13. VMI's mixed team had a 45-81, and the women's team had a 43-63. The Georgia Southern had a small bore score of 23-35 and an air rifle score of 23-78. The VMI mixed team had a 22-54 small bore, 23-27 air. The VMI women's team, small bore score of 20-94 and an air of 22-69. For the scoring teams, Georgia Southern small bore was Addie Burrow with a 587, Emma Pullman with a 585, Bremen Butler with a 582, And Zahara Gonzalez-Meza with a 581. In an air rifle, Emma Pullman shot a career high of 597. Ella Goldfeden with a 595. Bremen Butler with a 594. And Zahara Gonzalez-Meza with a 592. The top shooter for Georgia Southern was Ella Goldfeden with an aggregate of an 1184. She was actually an individual shooter. She was not part of any of the shooting teams. So the VMI mixed team, we saw Ryan Harlow with a 572 small bore, Christopher Hicks with a 571, Michael Ball with a 557, and Michael Ananesi with a 554. Their air rifle team was Christopher Hicks with a 588, Ryan Harlow with a 587, Caitlin Gorchowski with a 582, and Michael Ananesi with a 570. Their top shooter was Ryan Harlow with a 1159 aggregate. Then the VMI women's team, we saw Victoria Phillips with a 552 small bore, Adriana Sellers with a 541, Emma Cameron with a 535, and Smita Liskarswin with a 466. And their air rifle team was Victoria Phillips with a 583, Emma Cameron with a 581, Adriana Saunders with a 555, Darian Tweedle with a 550. The top shooter for the women's team was Victoria Phillips with an 1135. Next match of the weekend was Akron versus Memphis at Akron. We saw Akron topping that with an aggregate 46.95 to Memphis's 46.75. Akron shot a 23.16 small bore and a program record air of 23.79. Memphis shot a 23.05 small bore and a 23.70 air. The scoring teams for Akron, for small bore, we saw Lex Kirk with a 582. We got a pair of matching 580s from Aaron Schnupp and Gavin Perkowski, and Andrew DeRoss with a 574. And then in air, we saw Lex Kirk with a 596, Gavin Perkowski with a 595, and a pair of 594s from both Andrew DeRoss and Natalia Seek. Top shooter was Lex Kirk with an 1178. For Memphis, Gabrielle Zeik with a 586, Kenley Uton with a 577, Angeline Henry with a 572, and Sophie Cruz with a 570, all in small bore. And then their air rifle team, Gabriella Zeik with a 596, Kenley Uton with a 595, Angeline Henry 590, and Jack Kersey with a 589. The top shooter from Memphis was Gabriella Zeik with an 1182. Then we're going to move on to the Naval Academy in Annapolis, where we saw Kentucky versus Navy. Kentucky topped that one with a 47.07 to Navy's 47.01. Kentucky shot a 23.29 small bore and a 23.78 air. Navy shot a 23.36 small bore and a 23.65 air. The scoring teams, Kentucky's small bore team was Sophia Cicerello with a 586, Jaden Thompson with a 582, as well as Emmy Sellers with a 582, Martin Voss with a 579. And then in air, Sophia Cicerello with a 599, Jaden Thompson with a 595, Braden Pizer with a 594, and Allison Buessler with a 590. The Kentucky's top shooter was Sophia Cicerello with an 1185 aggregate. And for the Navy, in their small bore team was Isabella Baldwin with a 589, Marley Duncan with a 584, Stephanie Millivane with a 583, and Ryan Wee with a 580. Their air rifle team, we saw a pair of 593s from Clarissa Leyland and Isabella Baldwin, saw a 592 from Marley Duncan, and Ryan Wee with a 587. And Navy's top shooter was Isabella Baldwin with an 1182. Then we saw a trio of teams at TCU. Saw WVU, TCU, and Nebraska. WVU topped that one with a 47.48 aggregate to TCU's 47.30, and Nebraska had a 46.99. WVU small bore was a 23.66 and a 23.82 air. TCU shot a 23.47 small bore, 23.83 air, and Nebraska had a 23.27 small bore, 23.72 air. The scoring teams for WVU, we saw Molly McGinn with a 595, Mary Tucker with a 593, Griffin Lake with a 590, and Matt Sanchez with a 588. In an air, Mary Tucker topped that one with a 597. Then we saw a trio of 595s from Griffin Lake, Gavin Barnick, and Matt Sanchez. And the top shooter for West Virginia was Mary Tucker with an 1190. And TCU's teams, for small bore, we saw Stephanie Grunso with a 591, Katie Zahn with a 589, Nicole Hogan with a 584, and Jeannie Haverhill with a 583. Their air teams, we saw Stephanie Grenzo with a 597. We saw a career high from Jeannie Haverhill with a 596. Then I had a pair of 595s from Katie Zahn and Nicole Hogan. And the top shooter for TCU was Stephanie Grenzo with an 1188 aggregate. And then Nebraska, their small bore team was Cecilia Ossie with a 588, Emma Rode with a 582, Tori Watts with a 579, and Mackenzie Strauch with a 578. And their air rifle team was Cecilia Ossie with a 596, Emma Rode with a 593, Mackenzie Strauch with a 592, and Tori Watts with a 591. The top shooter for Nebraska was Cecilia Ossie with an 1184 aggregate. Then we saw another trio of teams competing at Ohio State. We saw Memphis, Ohio State, and Moorhead competing. Memphis topped that one with an aggregate 47-10, which was a program record. Then we saw Ohio State with a 47-05, and Moorhead State with a 46-80. Memphis had a small bore score of 23-28 and a program record high of 23-82 in air. Ohio had a 23-32 small bore, 23-73 air, and Moorhead State had a 23-20 small bore and a 23-60 air. The scoring teams from Memphis, their small bore teams, Kenley Uton with a 585, had a pair of 584s from Gabriella Zake and Angeline Henry, and Jack Kersey with a 575. Then we saw Gabriella again and Angeline tied with 597s in air. Kenley Uton had a 595, and Jack Kersey with a 593. Memphis' top shooter was Angeline Henry with an 1181 aggregate. For Ohio, we saw Derek Kaiser, small bore, with a 585, Victor Kiss with a 583, Lillian Warren with a 582, as well as Paige Hollowell with a 582. And then in air, we saw Derek Kaiser with a 597, which was a personal record for him, Victor Kiss with a 596, Paige Hollowell with a 595, and Lillian Warren with a 585. Top shooter for Ohio was Derek Kaiser with an 1182 aggregate. The coach from Ohio said this was a record start for the season for them. This is their third consecutive match with a score over 4,700, which is a program first. So that's impressive for Ohio. And Moorhead State, we saw Bryce Ward in small bore with a 586, Grace Weber with a 582, Adriana Beard with a 579, and Maria Koenig with a 573. And in air, Adriana Beard with a 593, Cassidy Wilson with a 592, Grace Weber with a 588, and Andrew Morris with a 587. And Moorhead's top shooter was Adriana Beard with an 1172. Next match, WVU was still led TCU, but it was just WVU versus Nebraska that day. This is on Sunday. They had an aggregate score of 47-32 to Nebraska's aggregate of 47-22. WV small bore score was a 23-52 and their air was a 23-80. Nebraska had a 23-45 small bore and a 23-77 air. WVU's scoring team was Molly McGinn, 590 small bore, Matt Sanchez, 589, Griffin Lake with a 587, and Tal Engler with a 586. In an air, we saw a pair of 596s from Griffin Lake and Molly McGinn, Mallory Brown with a 595, and Matt Sanchez with a 593. Their top shooter was Molly McGinn with an aggregate of 1186. And for Nebraska, small bore team was Emma Strode with a 588. Then Tori Watts and Cecilia Ossie both had 587s. Mackenzie Strauch rounded it out with a 583. And their air rifle, we saw Cecilia Ossie with a 598, Tori Watts with a 596, Emma Rode with a 592, and Charlotte Mick with a 591. And the top shooter for Nebraska in this match was Cecilia Ossie with an 1185. Final match of the weekend, we saw Jacksonville State competing against the Citadel again. This is their second match of the weekend. Jacksonville State topped that one with a 46-70 versus Citadel's mixed team of 46-15. Jacksonville State had a 23-05 small bore, 23-65 air versus Citadel's 22-83 small bore and 23-32 air. The scoring teams for Jacksonville State and small bore, we saw Sam Burrow with a 584, Franz Rasmussen with a 579, Clark McWhorter with a 572, and Lars Lillinge with a 570. And in air, Sam Burrow had a 596, Franz Rasmussen with a 593, Annie Iannotti with a 589, and Lars Lillinger with a 587. Jacksonville's top shooter for the weekend was Sam Burrow with an 1180. And then Citadel's mixed team, we saw James Hart IV with a small bore score of 584, Charlotte Welsh with a 581, Carson Wood with a 566, and Daniel Shapiro with a 552. And their air scores were James Hart IV with a 591, Charlotte Welsh with a 588, Carson Wood with a 582, and Daniel Shapiro with a 571. And Citadel's top shooter was James Hart IV with an 1175. So that's it for the matches for this weekend. And we have a huge slate coming up this final weekend. It looks like we've got 14 different matches. On Friday, we've got Akron at Kentucky. And then on Saturday, we got Akron versus Ole Miss at Kentucky. We got Air Force and Army and Navy all competing at Army. We got Murray State, UTEP, and Ohio State all competing in Ohio. Then we got MIT versus Norwich, Alaska Fairbanks at TCU, Nebraska at the Citadel, Alabama Birmingham at VMI. And then on Sunday, we've got Alaska Fairbanks versus TCU again. Then we got Kentucky against Ole Miss, Murray State versus UTEP at Ohio, Army versus Air Force at Army, North Georgia versus Jacksonville State, and Wofford versus Georgia Southern. So that's all coming up this coming weekend. So it's going to be a full busy weekend of watching scoring on pretty much everything you can find is going to be on Megalink this weekend. So a quick review of the Pan American Games small bore, or the 3-position small bore that we weren't able to review last weekend. Pan Americans are pretty much winding down now in San Diego, Chile. On Wednesday, October 25th, the women's 3-piece small bore competition was held. The 2 U.S. women shooters were Sagan Maddalena and Mary Tucker. Both Mary and Sagan shot qualifying scores for finals. Mary fired a 590 with 32 centers. Sagan fired the top score of 596 with 40 centers, which is also a new world record score. Then finals were held later in the day. Sagan Maddalena fired a final score of 457.2 for a silver medal. Mary won gold with a final score of 458.4. A couple days later, on Friday, October 27th, the men's 3P small bore events were held. We saw Timothy Sherry and Lucas Kaczynski competing for U.S. In the qualification round, Lucas fired a second-place qualifying score of 588 with 30 centers. Timothy fired a top qualifying score of 590 and 32 centers. Then just after noon, the finals were held. Lucas won bronze with a final score of 438.8, and Timothy came away with silver with a score of 449.5. So the U.S. shooters had great success down in Chile this past couple weeks. And just a quick reminder about the Gary Anderson Invitational match. This year's dates are being held on December 1st and 2nd in Anniston, and on December 2nd at Camp Perry in Port Clinton, Ohio. So go ahead and quickly get registered for that match. And so you can check out all of our show notes at centertens.com for links to scorecards and other information that we discussed. Thank you for listening, and remember, the most important shot is always the one that is in front of you. Thank you for listening to Season 1 of Center Tens. If you like the show, please leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast and Spotify. This helps out tremendously. Give us a follow on Instagram and Facebook at Center Tens. Center Tens can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Buzzsprout, Pocket Cast, and at centertens.com. Hope you join us for our next episode.